guidance, and resources.
This meeting is being recorded.
That intentionally center racial justice and equity principles and practices within sex education. And we're also going to have an opportunity today to hear directly from young people about their experiences and what they want to learn. I want to also just note who this webinar is being hosted by the Future of Sex Education Initiative. That's a partnership of the Advocates for Youth, Answer, and SECUS, who seek to create a national dialogue about the future of sex education and to promote the institutionalization of comprehensive sex ed in public schools. Sex Education Collaborative, it's a collaborative of 23 state, regional, and national organizations with extensive experience training educators to deliver school-based sex education. The SEC aims to support educators and administrators to provide high-quality sex education no matter where they are or what they need. And finally, WOCSHN, the Women of Color Sexual Health Network. It's a group of women, femme-identifying, and gender-expansive sexuality professionals who focus on the needs and sexual and reproductive health needs for women of color and other identifying folks. The true mission of this working group is to empower and to include more folks of color in the profession of sexuality, sexology, and sexual health. So for today's presentation, we're going to start with the what. We're going to hear from Chris Harley from SECUS and Dr. Rena Dixon from Fact Forward. They're going to share with us some lessons learned and recommendations for centering racial justice in sex education. And they will each share newly released reports that we hope will inform how you're going to move this work forward. Then we're going to focus on the why, and we're going to hear directly from a panel of young folks who are going to share their experiences with you and what they want to learn in sex education. And then finally, we're going to get to the now what, and we're going to hear from Advocates for Youth about one concrete tool that you can use right now to implement sex education that's going to center on racial justice and equity. So I'd like to start with the what, and we're going to begin with Chris Harley, who is the president and CEO of SECUS. She's going to share details of a report co-authored by SECUS and WOCSHN on race, sex, and politics that will be released tomorrow. How exciting. This is going to look at the ways that various populations of color experienced sexualization and how it impacts politics and systemics of oppression in schools. Chris will also discuss why it's so important to incorporate a racial justice lens into sex education programs and curriculum and address the basic question of why it matters and why this should be part of the discussion. I'm happy to introduce to you Chris Harley. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Mariana. So good to see you, my partner in crime on this. So thanks to everyone for being here today and for joining us for this important conversation. I am really proud to share that tomorrow SECUS and WOCSHN will be publishing this report, Sex, Race, and Politics in the United States, a call to action to address racial justice in sex education. It's brand new. And what I want to say is that this publication really stems from an event that we participated in where we were in a room of sex educators where we spent 3 days together discussing racial justice, microaggressions. There were trainings, there were breakout groups, there was discussion. It was a wonderfully well-rounded event, really focusing on racial justice. And then at the end, we received a comment that was like, that was a really nice couple days together, but why does it matter? I'm a sex educator. And it was this light bulb moment for me that as we're talking about racial justice, as we're centering the needs of communities of color, there was this, ongoing perpetuation in the sex ed field of kind of trying to assume a colorblind approach to human sexuality, as though communities of color can separate out their racialization from our sexual identities. And so this report is really an effort to try to pull those threads together, connect the dots between how communities of color have had their sexuality racialized and demonized and weaponized in ways that then inform the public policies that create the systems of racial discrimination and oppression that we are continuing to fight against. To look at how these manifest in the classroom as well. And then, trying to connect the threads with the national sex ed standards that were released in 2020 to help, again, sort of connect the dots between this history, the realities of today, and the ways in which sex education can play a really vital role, and sex educators can play a really vital role in helping to recognize the basic humanity and normalcy of the sexuality of communities of color. So our basic thesis is that white supremacy demonizes the sexuality of communities of color as a form of population control to maintain power over racial and ethnic groups through political, economic, and social dominance. And I think that we can see this inherent fear popping up again in the out loud conversations about great replacement theory. This idea that it's a life or death scenario concerning the fate of white America, that if we don't stop non-white populations growth from happening, the country is on a suicidal path to no longer be the America that it has historically been, or that it is perceived of in kind of a white supremacist imagination. This conversation I'm seeing more and more pop up in public policy conversations, looking at the rise of the radical right, and in the kind of policy conversations that are happening in conservative circles right now. And the fear is that this theory often coincides directly and indirectly with calls for violence. And so there is a real need for us as people who support positive, healthy human sexuality development to recognize that we have to stop those conversations that weaponize and demonize sexuality for some groups and not for others, clearly. I do want to say that it was really hard to write this entire publication and talk about all of the different ways in which this manifests. And so we do have a caveat that in the document that we were not able to capture all of the ways in which these threads intersect together in these ways. And we also wanted to recognize that much of the historical discussion use gender binaries that can erase sexual orientation, the gender spectrum, and other intersectional identities. And so we kind of recognize that, but wanted to still have this conversation where we're looking at the ways that racialized sexuality shows up. Next slide. So this is a really messy slide, but I think it sort of exemplifies why this is so important, right? We argue that sex educators must have a shared understanding of how racialized sexual identities have impacted the lived experiences of communities of color in America, and recognizing that in some instances that these stereotypes have been used as a justification of public policy, again, that creates these systems of discrimination. So there's a timeline that explores sort of key moments in history, and then we spend some time breaking down the ways that stereotypes have been used to define communities of color. So we look at the ways that Indigenous communities have been subjected to acts of genocide, including forced abortion, sterilization, and the prevention of parenting, which includes the forced removal of children from target populations to be raised by the dominant group. We see that play out in public policy in the United States. And this is important because, for example, there's the history of Indian boarding schools where, again, young Indigenous youth were taken from their families and forcibly removed. We now know that over 200 children died as a result of this practice. But it's not as though that ended in the 1800s. In 2020, the Supreme Court, no, not 2020, 2012, the Supreme Court took up a case of the Indian Child Welfare Act, where they eradicated the protections to keep Indigenous youth in their tribal communities in favor of allowing them to be adopted out by non-Indigenous communities, which perpetuates the way in which Indigenous populations experience cultural genocide. We talk about the legacy of sexual control during enslavement, but how post-slavery, Black women continue to be hypersexualized, and as a result, have seen a redoubling of efforts to control their reproduction. That Black women in particular are simultaneously shamed and penalized for exercising reproductive autonomy. I think we see what's happening right now in the fight around abortion, exemplifying the ways in which women of color in particular are put at the forefront of being attacked for exercising reproductive autonomy. They'll talk about how Black men have been cast as violent and dangerous sexual predators, and again, how that continues to contribute to over-policing of Black communities. We talk about non-European immigration and the ways in which immigrant women in particular have been cast as dangerous, sexually promiscuous, and a threat to American values. That these stereotypes are linked to access to public benefits and citizenship. And in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been upticks in conversation on public charge and whether or not immigrant communities should be able to access to public benefits they're eligible for, as well as attacks on so-called anchor babies in the DACA program, in which immigrant children are, there's an effort to remove their eligibility for citizenship. So I wanted to make clear all of these things are interconnected, that what's happening in specific communities of color may manifest or rematerialize across other communities of color at different points in history and in time, and yet replicate these kind of racialized trauma that different communities experience. These are also all examples in which public policy was created where weaponized sexuality of communities of color were used to justify adverse public policies that create these systems of oppression that we fight against. And so it's really important for us to connect these dots and to understand that when we demonize the sexuality of specific population groups, the public policies that result from that weaponization lead to essentially attacks to prevent these communities from being able to take root and thrive in this country. Next slide. Okay, and so then the document starts to look at specific threads in which public policies have evolved over time that target particular types of particular veins of access for communities of color. So we look at immigration policy. And one of the things that we look at is that the very first immigration law is the 1875 Page Act. And this law basically cast all Asian women. So this was enacted during the time when Chinese people were coming to the United States as part of the gold rush. And the Page Act specifically targeted Chinese women, casting them as lewd and immoral prostitutes and preventing them from being able to immigrate to the United States. And this was an effort to prevent Chinese families from thriving in America, from preventing them from happening in America. But this is the very first immigration law. And so all subsequent immigration law is based off of this precedent. It's restrictive and it primarily targets non-European population groups, their ability to migrate, their ability to access public benefit programs, their right to claim US citizenship. We also look at access to public benefit programs. Certainly the way in which Black women's sexuality has been weaponized and viewed with suspicion in their ability to raise families, to have autonomy over their reproductive abilities, continues to play out today, where, over and over again, not only does the law really attack their, the ability of low-income families, in particular community women and families of color, from accessing public benefits programs, but tying all kinds of restrictive tests to this access as a way of both shaming and weaponizing, demonizing these communities from accessing these programs, even when we know that these programs benefit all Americans and especially low-income white families. And so it's this way in which sexuality is weaponized and demonized in public policy that plays out. I think I'm going over time, so I'm gonna skip to the next slide. And then we try to tie the threads to how this shows up in public schools. We talked about the Indian boarding schools and the forced cultural assimilation and genocide. We also look at segregation policies and school resourcing, where we know that under-resourced schools are less able to teach to comprehensive sex education programs, and the ways in which resourcing of schools plays out with charter school fights, where youth of color, are disproportionately directed towards special education, and in the way that those reductions in support for schools contribute to policing and school-to-prison pipelines. So all of these factors playing out in the way that particularly youth of color and our most vulnerable youth in under-resourced schools fail to receive the kind of support that they need because of these kinds of policies. We also recognize the way in which abstinence only until marriage programs put a specific burden on kids of color through their success sequencing ideology that lays blame to young people who engage in sexual activity outside of marriage as a way of, saying that their lack of or potential lack of economic success is directly attributed to that. And again, that message is specifically geared towards communities of color. Okay, next slide. So then the last thing that we wanted to do was try to make this useful and user-friendly for sex educators. So not only is this a call to action, but it is a resource for helping to embed some of these lessons and ideas into sex ed curriculum. And so one of the things that we do is we offer a series of questions for sex educators to look at and consider in the way that they approach sex education, to make sure that they are able to speak directly to the needs and realities of the young kids of color who may be in the classroom and curriculum with them. And so I'm going to stop there because I think the subsequent conversation is going to really tease this part of the report out much more thoroughly and in depth. But we do hope that this report is helpful in hopefully putting to bed the idea that human sexuality is colorblind and universal. That there are specific ways in which the weaponization of sexuality for specific racialized and ethnic groups plays out in US policy, and that we as sex educators must take on a direct and clear role in challenging, pushing back, and undermining those attacks on human sexuality for racialized community groups in order to reset the conversation around some of these public policies and undermining the justification that allows for them to exist. So I will conclude there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm so excited that this report is now going to be available to the public and that people can use it to help center the way that they want to do their work, and in particular to really be clear about how they're going to engage and operationalize racial justice in their sexuality education. Thank you so much for coming today and sharing this with us. Always happy to work in partnership with you. All right, wonderful folks, we have gotten off to a great start, and I am so excited as we transition to our next presenter. We are now going to hear from Dr. Rena P. Dixon, who is the Director of Community Investment and Impact at Fact Forward. Just a personal note, they have an amazing summer institute that I was excited to be a part of. And if you don't know about it, I'm going to need you to get on it, get to know about it so you can be there next year. I'm going to be there next year. It's a wonderful conference, really great information, great presenters, wonderful time. I call it Dr. Rena's Conference. But Dr. Rena is going to share with us the details of the practice paper that she co-authored with other members of the Sex Education Collaborative, Centering Racial Justice in Sex Education, Strategies for Engaging Professionals and Young People. So this paper that was released in May for Sex Ed for All Month serves as a guide to providing a racially just and equitable practice for those working in sex education. Dr. Rena will share suggested recommendations that are outlined in the practice paper to provide the field with tangible strategies to keep the conversations going and the progress moving forward. I'm excited to introduce to you Dr. Rena Dixon. Hey, friend.
Hey, friend. Thank you for the fabulous introduction. And thank you, Chris, for the wonderful setup, because I think what we're going to get into next is going to dovetail very nicely into what actually racial just and equitable inequity in a curriculum and in administrative practices for sex educators looks like in practice. So a little bit of background. We went on this journey through the Sex Education Collaborative starting around December of 2019, when we realized that there needed to be some type of racial justice and equity framework around sex education. And we thought we were going to create standards, much like the professional learning standards. And we decided to move away from that. We realized that it wasn't about a checklist. And we had some funding to be able to do key informant interviews to figure out what that would look like. And what blossomed was this beautiful document that was released in May that is a true labor of love, of collaboration, of understanding what it means to be a racially just sex educator, and how do you support those Black and Brown sex educators that you may have on your staff. And then as you're building curriculum and programs, what does that look like in practice? So one of the things that we found in starting our research project was that Black and Brown youth are more likely to receive sex education that is negative and shaming. It also led us to find that it's assumed that Black and Brown youth are already sexually active, and that they are sex is taught to them in a way that it is seen as dangerous, inherently dangerous. So we want to be able to denote, how do we change the narrative so that the education is really equitable and centers Black and Brown youth in their lived experience, as well as a lot of things that Chris was talking about in her presentation of, we know how Black and Brown bodies have been politicized. How do we flow that over into a curriculum? So through our key informant interviews, we found that there were three real big themes that emerged, which were the curriculum. What are the guiding principles of a curriculum? What does the content need to look like? The temperament of the educator. So what internal and external factors do you need to have and understand as a sex educator? And then what are the administrative practices? Because it's more than just sending someone out to do this curriculum. You actually need to support the people who are doing it. And Black and Brown sex educators have normally been put into situations where they are not allowed to thrive and present their best selves when doing this work. So I want to take some time to focus on the curriculum aspects and what we found out about guiding principles. And what really emerged were the 5 main principles: ethics, mutuality, and care. So understanding that we have an obligation to treat others and organize social relations and institutions and structures around ethics and mutuality. That's one of the core foundations of public health, but it really needs to be enforced when talking about sex education in the classroom and making it racially just. Another avenue is autonomy and choice, establishing bodily autonomy and choice as a right of every human being, regardless of age. It's important for us to influence that with our youth, especially youth of color, because they may not have had that impressed upon them before. Understanding that every body is valuable, appreciating diversity and worthiness and respectability for the need of all kinds of bodies, not just one type, not just one color. Making sure that our education content is LGBTQI plus inclusive, and how we are acknowledging students of color and their lived experiences around all types of gender identities and sexual identities. Also, collaboration and interdependence, knowing that there is a lot of intersection in the work that we do and how it relates to sex education. So talking about how those are intertwined and not just, and one of our key informants noted that an interjustice principle is needed, but we just can't do it alone. So it's really important to focus on how can we collaborate to make this happen. Also, when looking at curriculum, we want to look at content to understand what content should be included in a curriculum that's focused for Black and Brown youth. And that really goes back to a lot of things that are traditionally not included. So looking at issues that affect different communities, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Different communities in different pockets of the United States or wherever you might be, it doesn't have to be the United States, experience things differently based on their history, based on culture of the region that they live in, and that has to be brought into any type of curriculum that you are doing. You also want to talk about social policy. What Chris was referencing before in her presentation is super important to include, because that fuels how we feel about issues, what we've been taught, how our elders in our communities have taught us and brought us up. So unpacking that and understanding it in terms of a sex education curriculum is important. Also remembering to talk about pop culture, music, art, videos, utilizing, for me, especially African-American vernacular, it's important. Talking about pleasure, talking about stereotypes, celebration of Black and Brown people throughout history and in movements is important to understand culture and awareness of how we're moving this issue forward. Also talking about acknowledging cultural messaging around sex and differences in how these concepts can be applied in the space that they're in. So we want to talk about including all of those things. But then when talking about outcomes, there are specific learning and experiential outcomes that we want to see embedded into a curriculum. And there are 4 distinct learning outcomes that we talk about. The first is increased critical consciousness, awareness of systems that such as anti-Blackness, fat phobia, colorism, and their impact on present-day experiences of sexuality. This also includes skill building and development for effectively naming and dismantling these systems. We also want increased capacity for self-reflection, increased ethical competence, and increased self-mastery. So that means awareness of one's own body and its needs and capacity to engage with that as you move through your sexual experiences. One thing to note when we're talking about learning outcomes is also 2 things that emerged that were very important, which were increased sense of physical safety when youth are participating in a program and increased sense of psychological safety. So we can't forget that when we're talking about developing curriculum and delivering curriculum. I do want to be able to touch on temperament for educators and what we want to see from educators. So internal, racially just and equitable facilitators need to have a politicized understanding of their own and others' identities. It is important to do the work, understand the biases that you have and bring to the table based on your experiences and upbringing, and how that impacts how do you deliver sex education. Exceptional emotional intelligence. We hear that term a lot. It's kind of become a buzzword, but emotional intelligence is something that everyone has to talk about sex and how that engages both the mind and body. Educators should also have exceptional self-reflection and awareness. There might be times where it's difficult to do the work, especially in a racial just and equitable way. And even then you need time to self-reflect on how to deliver the best program to your young people. There are also some external factors, which include actively increased inclusivity and accessibility, perpetual responsiveness and flexibility to shifts in the environment and students' experiences, willingness to embrace where students are in their learning experience, and ability to talk about race. It's important. We hear a lot from young people that they want that acknowledged because we don't live in a colorblind society. So bringing that practice into to have comfortability talking about sex is important. Sorry, y'all, my Georgia accent gets in the way of me talking sometimes. For people who are not of color, for our white educators, actively pursuing partnerships with educators and trainers of color is important for learning and coaching, so that you are acknowledging the ways that we're different and how you can bring those ways that we are different into your classroom. We recognize that there's no way for all of us to know all about everything in doing this work. So we have to lean on each other for supports to make sure that our youth are getting the best possible education and care that they can. Also, using a peer system for accountability is important. We need to know when to call each other up, call each other frontward to change behaviors, and having a peer system is important to that. The last thing that I want to talk about are administrative practices. So we want to make sure that we're building systems that are ideal and equitable. We want to make space to support Black and Brown leadership and make sure this is genuine and not a check the box approach. We want to respect as authorities and experts in our work, our Black and Brown leaderships, and provide opportunities for caucusing. A lot of times there are spaces where we as people of color need to talk to other people of color about what we've experienced. So how are you providing space for that so that your educators are in an environment where they can thrive? We also want to address work conditions and stop using people of color and as identities as replacement for sound curricula. It's a Band-Aid, and we really want to make sure that they are not being used as pawns to check a box. So having a system where you can check your administrative practices and give your staff the best situation possible to deliver this curriculum. That was a lot, but I really encourage all of you to read the document that we have put together for you. You can find it on the Sex Education Collaborative website. It's called Centering Racial Justice in Sex Education, Strategies for Engaging Professionals and Young People. You can download it for free. And we also have in there a organizational assessment that you can use to get started to see where your organization falls in doing this work. There's a glossary for some terms if you're not sure what it means. And I am always available to answer any questions that you may have about this project and how you can go about doing this work in your setting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rena. So excited for this work that you continue to lead, and excited that this particular resource will be available to folks. So I just want to note before we transition to our youth panel, young people's panel, that the webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be shared with everyone who registered. And that includes the slides and the links to all of the resources that you're going to hear about during today's webinar. So I just wanted to make sure that that is clear for folks. We appreciate all of the questions that you continue to enter into the Q&A portion for the chat, and we encourage your engagement and are excited that you all are asking great questions and making sure that you are involved in this process with us. So we're now going to transition to the young people's part of our webinar today. And I'm always excited to hear from young folks. As someone who started off in this movement as a young person, it's important to make sure that you hear what young people need to say about what they want, what they're hoping for, and the support that we can offer as grown kids. I'm not a young kid anymore, I'm a youthful elder, but it's important to be mindful that young people definitely have a part to play and that they need to be seen and heard by us. As we're the ones who are doing the work, we get to show them and teach them and learn from them in this process. I'm excited to welcome the panel of young folks who are going to share their firsthand experiences and discuss what they wish they were learning in sex education. We'll also hear from Answer about new articles that have been written by their teen staff about the importance of racial and reproductive justice for youth and the lessons they have available on what racial and reproductive justice are, why Black mothers don't talk to their children about sex, and the sexualization of AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander women. I'm excited to introduce Dan Rice, who is the executive director of Answer, and the youth panelists who work with Fact Forward, Advocate for Youth, and Sex, etc. These are teen staff writers. And so I want to introduce Dan Rice, Sabrine, Gabriella, Lania, Serna, Sophia, and Brianne. Welcome, all of you.
Thanks so much, Marietta. I'm going to ask all the panelists to please turn on their cameras and we'll get started. All right. Great. Welcome, everyone. I feel so honored to have the opportunity to talk with all of you today and to share your expertise and your experiences with everybody who's joining us this afternoon. So, Sophia, I'd like to actually start off with you. Since you are still in high school, I would love to hear a little bit about what your K-12 sex education experience is, and specifically if racial justice was a lens that was used within your sex education.
My experience was not at all comprehensive. In 4th through 6th grade, I remember distinctly, like, we were separated by gender, and which did not make sense at all to me. And then, you know, in middle school, I remember like the year that we were supposed to really learn about sex education and really dig into it, I went through like 3 different teachers. So I never even really got the opportunity to get super, super comfortable in it and get through like full lessons and stuff. And then obviously the pandemic came and it cut my classes short as well. So my main sources when it came to sex education have been coming from just working at Sex, Etc., which has been a really great opportunity. And also Teen Pep, which is a program at my school where peer educators teach freshmen about sex education. But all of these opportunities, while I'm very grateful for them, they're not something that everyone gets. And I think that everyone really should be getting them. Racial justice was not a part of it at all.
Sophia, I know you're in New Jersey. I'd love to hear from Gabriella. Gabriella, I know you work with Fact Forward. Did you also go to school in South Carolina?
I did. So I did move from New York in my elementary school days, but I know even like when I moved down here, there was a big difference between the schools. So like schools in New York didn't really talk about sex education or really any racial justice at all. And I know when I got to South Carolina, as soon as I hit middle school, it was always a 1 week based where they talked about just the simple kinds of education when it came to sex, but it was always like hormones and like what does your body go through, and it was always very simple. I have been blessed with a mom who actually, you know, had to talk at an early age, so I wasn't as much as clueless as maybe other people were. But at the same time, you know, like there was still questions that, you know, you would want to ask and things like that. And as I got to high school, it was kind of basically the same concept, what you go through with your hormones, you know, the different STDs and the different STIs. So, you know, being able to work with Fact Forward has really opened up like different things for me, because I was able to also know like more information than what you get at school and more resources in terms of information as well.
Great, thanks, Gabriella. Speaking of talking with your parents and your parents having the talk with you, Sabrine, I know during your time at Sex, Etc., you wrote a story about this. Could you tell everybody a little bit about that story and why you thought it was important to write it?
Yes, I'd love to. So yeah, during my time at Sex, Etc., I got the opportunity to write a story about why Black parents don't speak to their daughters about sex. really what kind of motivated that was my personal experience with that. I was also blessed with a mom who was very open to allowing me to ask questions about sex and health education as a whole. Never really shamed me for it. But I did also run into a lot of instances with other family members in which that would happen often. And it also seemed that a lot of my other peers who are young Black women who identified as young Black women were experiencing those experiences as well. And so that kind of inspired me to when I start that conversation, or continue the conversation, I should say, surrounding that. And yeah, I got the chance to kind of like give voices to some of the experiences of people that I was around, and kind of dive into the history behind why that is the case and why it seems that each generation continues to kind of carry on this stigma around the young Black girls and families questioning and feeling curious about how sex education works.
Thank you for doing that. Serena, you also wrote a story for Sex, Etc. I'd love if you could do the same, share with the audience a little bit about the story and why you thought it was important to write it.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, my connection might be a little bit choppy right now. But I wrote a story about the sexualization of API women, and specifically like East Asian women, for Sex, Etc. I think a month or two ago. And it was inspired by the events that kind of sparked the Stop Asian Hate movement in 2021. So like the spa shootings in Atlanta. And also as my personal experiences as an East Asian girl in America. And it was just a lot of like microaggressions that I had picked up from my peers and also from like adults, and also the experiences of my like fellow East Asian like women that I've heard from, that inspired me to write the article. But I think it was a really important kind of story to put out there, because especially because a lot of people are paying attention to the sexualization and like the fetishization of East Asian women because of the events of 2021. And I thought that I'd kind of keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Serena. Linnea, I know you're a youth advocate with Advocates for Youth. Would you like to share about a project that you've worked on specifically related to racial justice and sex education? Tell the folks why you thought it was important.
Hi, everyone. So I have not worked on a project for raising awareness around racial justice and sex education. However, I am interested in working on a project to raise awareness because I have personally seen how the lack of proper education disproportionately affects young people of color. And I definitely feel raising awareness will help strengthen the racial justice cause.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Advocates?
So this is something that I've started. This is a new initiative, so I haven't yet been able to participate in much work.
All right, awesome, thank you. And Brienne, you are also a youth advocate with Advocates for Youth, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. You want to tell us a little bit about the work and why you think it's important?
Yes, I think it's important about, racial justice and sex education with youth. I haven't yet started working as much as I like to, but I know that I did do a few projects with other organizations in my college campus. Last semester, we did a project called What Sex Got to Do with It. And it was basically create a safe space for Black women to come in and just talk about their sexual experiences and how to have safe sex, what consent is, and just basically talking about your sexual health. It was a really great event.
Awesome. Thanks, Brienne. The next question I'm just going to put out there, and anybody who wants to chime in with a response, feel free to unmute. And the question really is, what do you think is gained or missed by having or not having racial justice as part of the sex education curriculum? So what do you think young people gain from that or miss from that if they don't have it? Linnea?
Yes, I believe having racial justice as part of the sex education curriculum allows young people of color to receive a sex education that is relevant to them. Including racial justice also allows for young people of color to recognize how socioeconomic, educational, criminal justice, and health disparities in correlation to American history affect access to resources. As well as teaching the history makes it possible for young people to make decisions based on full factual information that is presented without personal opinion or prejudice.
So important. And many of those things were discussed in the reports that were just presented on from SECUS, WOCSHN, and Fact Forward. So thank you.
Yes.
How about others?
I'd love to add, I believe that it definitely takes away from the relatability. I found a lot of times in my sex education experiences throughout high school specifically, that, you know, I wouldn't really be able to see myself within a lot of the conversations that were happening. I didn't feel like I was being represented in any way. And I think in inviting a discussion about racial justice and how that is very relevant to sex education, I think then that allows for a lot more groups of young people to be able to see themselves within that work. I think that intersectionality is very important. And so, you know, certain circumstances don't necessarily apply to everyone and things like that. And so, yeah, I think it makes everything more inclusive, I feel like, when we kind of discuss this history that's very important and relevant to a lot of practices within sex education that we can see today.
Thanks, Sabrina. And Brianne, I saw you had unmuted as well.
Yes, I think that having racial justice as a part of a sex education curriculum will allow people of color to be heard and understood and break certain racial stereotypes associated with teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and other things like that. I also think it will also help to create a judgment-free zone and allow students to be open throughout the curriculum and ask for help and ask more questions and not be as scared because they're afraid that they're going to be judged.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, Sophia.
I think racial justice in sex education can really help understand current events for like people like my age, because there's a lot of, you know, things that we hear about, like, you know, there's like distrust in healthcare. There's like disparities in things like maternal health and stuff. And like a lot of times when we see those things, we don't, like, some people who like aren't aware of like racial justice and stuff and how it connects with sex education, they might see things like that and be like, oh, like that's just, you know, that's just how it is. But if we really like learn about it and it can help us understand that these are like systemic and they have like really deep roots. Yeah. But also what Lanai was saying about seeing intersection, I think I'm personally also very passionate about environmental justice and like seeing how like all of these things that we learn about in school and stuff all connect to sex education. I think that would be really impactful.
Anyone else want to chime in? Yes, Serena.
Yeah, I think one aspect of like sex education in our schools that's really lacking is like in racial justice is that it allows peers to kind of like people to kind of like see eye to eye with their peers and be able to treat others with more empathy and respect. And I think understanding racial issues and like the scope of like sexuality is like a really big part of that we're missing, because I think I forgot who, but someone brought up like dismantling stereotypes earlier, but like knowing about like the origins of those stereotypes or how they're like perpetuated in media or like society would really allow youth to be able to kind of see past them or understand their roots, and it would be like beneficial overall.
Absolutely. So we've got a question that came in through the Q&A from our viewers. So I'm going to share that and see anybody who wants to chime in. How have your peers, your family, and your community responded to you working in sexuality education? As someone touched on earlier, communities of color might be hesitant to do these types of conversations and work. So what's been the reaction to folks in your lives?
I can answer first. I know for a fact, like I had a lot of friends whose parents didn't really kind of talk to them or didn't have the proper education in terms of sexual education. So their reactions were a lot like beneficial. Like they were really good to have at least a friend who knows like what the different STDs are, like where can you go to get birth control, or where can you go to get tested for anything that you needed to get tested for. And they were actually very grateful to have, you know, my mom is very open to teaching other teens, you know, whose parents are not willing to or don't really know how to speak to their kids about, you know, certain different things. They were very grateful to have, you know, at least an adult that wasn't in their circle or wasn't a teacher or anybody that, you know, they were related to, that can go and speak to them and have them educated on certain things that they might have lacked or they might have had questions for a really long time.
Thanks, Gabriella. Anyone else want to share how the folks around them responded to you doing this type of work? Yeah, Sophia.
My grandmother is she's like a Latina immigrant from Ecuador, and she faced a lot of like discrimination and stuff and issues like relating to like sexuality and like, you know, like stereotyping and stuff like that. And so her finding out about like me doing this work actually made her like proud and like hopeful for and just kind of grateful that, you know, the world is moving in a direction where like people who are young are like not having to deal with this as often, or are trying to like make it so that people don't have to deal with this.
That's awesome. And Serena, I saw you had also unmuted.
When I first like told my mom that I was like applying to work for sex, etc., I think her first reaction was like, oh, like why would you want to do that? Like that seems so uncomfortable and awkward. And I think my family members also had similar reactions. All of them are Chinese immigrants. So sex has always been like a very taboo sort of topic in our household. I don't think I've ever talked about it with my parents until I started working for sex, etc. But anyway, I think over time they became a lot more receptive to conversations surrounding like sex education, like sexuality, intimacy, all those sorts of things, which like Sophia mentioned, like was a really positive change that I saw like with them. And yeah, I just think that having someone like a young person like have exposure to these kinds of topics can start really positive conversations between them and their family members. And yeah, it was a positive experience overall.
Great. We love to hear that folks who work at Sex, etc. are opening up conversations with their families. That's really awesome to hear. Anyone else want to share how the people around them reacted to them working?
I will share. I'd say that the response that I got was actually pretty positive. Overall, I didn't experience much pushback, but it definitely was a sense of awkwardness around kind of explaining what it was that I was going to write about. And I think I found myself, I guess you could say rewording or trying to find other words other than sex education as a way to explain what I was going to be doing or writing about. Even if it was primarily educational, I feel like just growing up a young Black girl, it was just very stigmatized for me to even express any like interest in advocating for these kinds of topics. So yeah, and I did have experiences with a few family members who kind of were just like kind of a sense of like, I don't know, not much joy and I guess a little bit of like a fear maybe or uncomfortableness with me kind of like even having these kinds of discussions. Because yeah, I think that just carries over time and time again a lot of times. Yeah, people in my culture and in my community just seem to be fearful that I'll take this education and I don't know, run with it. I don't know. To me, that's a good thing, but
exactly. That's exactly what we want you to do with it.
Yeah, that was my experience.
Thanks for sharing that, Sabrina. So we've just got a few minutes left, so I want to pose one more question out to the group, and that is, what would you want your former health teachers or sex educators or school administrators to know about the importance of including racial justice in sex education? what tips would you share with them on how they could make the classroom or the sex ed experience better? Brianne.
I'll start. So first, I want to say I know that these conversations can be uncomfortable at times, but I think it is important that educators show that our sex education is as honest about racial justice as it is on any other topic within sex education, because the goal of sex education is being taught that it's important to receive the necessary information to ensure everybody's proper sexual health. So I believe that the sex education lessons aren't supposed to be one size fits all, but instead should be catered to all the races, because everybody has different backgrounds and experiences, and it'll help students easily navigate through their sexual health and get the proper help that they need from their teachers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brianne. How about others? Lanaya.
Okay. Well, first off, I want administrators and teachers to know that sometimes the school building is the only place where the students have to turn to for accurate and safe sex education. Many don't have trusted adults or educators to turn to in other settings. So, it's important for the school to ensure reliable and relatable sex education to their youth, to really make sure that we can ensure equity in the real world. I feel like sometimes it's taking out of reference, but we all experience the world in different ways. And this really sets it up for us to be, on the same page.
Thanks, Lanaya. So true. Very important.
I feel the educators should not just only talk about, like what are the different, sex educations, or what comes with being abstinence, or what comes with, having sex, but also like, where can you go to, get birth control, or where can you go, if the place at school, like she also said, is the only place that you have, like, have more than just one multiple, teacher, not just one teacher, because maybe not everyone doesn't go through the same experiences, and not everyone deals with the same kind of issues. So maybe one needs to get a pregnancy test, or one needs to get a birth control, implant, or whatever the case may be. Different resources can help different people for different situations. And as well as racial justice, I feel like it should be, a topic that should really be touched on, because not everyone receives the same kind of care and receives the same kind of information, whether that be color, whether it be non-colored people, or anything like that. I feel like it should be something that's very common, and something that people are open or willing to be open to talk about, because it is a subject that's very important as our generation is coming up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are there any final thoughts, things that maybe you wanted to make sure you told our audience today but didn't get a chance to? Any final thoughts that anyone wants to share?
I'd love to just say that I really would advise everyone to not be afraid of looking into the, I guess you could say, history and underlying kind of messages behind a lot of these like unfortunate sex education practices or attempts at sex education. Because even in writing the piece that I wrote for Sex Etc. on this topic, when I was doing a lot of the work and like discussing these things with experts and kind of trying to get quotes from people, a lot of things that I ran into that I had an idea about already that ended up having so many layers to them were just so mind-blowing. They made sense of so much of the experiences that I had myself, and just kind of understanding like where that came from, and coming to that realization that so many things in my life will continue to be rooted in race, and will continue to kind of have that foundation of racism. It was a I guess you could say pivotal moment, and I think that everyone kind of should do that work and should do that research and be curious, like continue to ask, like, why is it that when I ask, or why is it that, when my friends act, but when I do, like be curious, ask those questions and look into that stuff. Cause I think you'll have a really, really big realization within yourself.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. And Serena, last one.
Yeah, I was going to say also, like, absolutely do not be afraid to start conversations with students or like young people about like racial justice and sex education, or just like the intersectionality of sexuality and race, because I think a lot of people are willing to talk about it, especially because I feel like young people just do not really get a say in their sex education. So I think it's really important to hear their perspectives as well.
Thanks, Serena. So I just want to share with everybody that Sabrine, Serena, and Sophia has a story that'll be coming out soon on the basics of reproductive justice in sex education. Their stories are all available on sexetcetera.org. I want to thank Lanaya, Sophia, Sabrine, Gabriella, Brianne, and Serena for sharing their expertise with us today and taking the time out of their day to talk about this important topic. So thank you. And I will pass it back over to Mariana.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to the wonderful youth panel. I so appreciate hearing your voices and your experiences and your wisdom, and look forward to seeing more of you and hearing your names more as we continue to do this work. We're going to transition now to our last presenter for the webinar today, and I'm excited to introduce one of my dear beloved friends, Dr. Nikisha Floyd, who is the Associate Director for the Racial Justice and Sex Education she's the Associate Director, Racial Justice and Sex Education at Advocates for Youth. And Dr. Nikisha is going to focus on the now what. We have heard today from our speakers about why it's important to center racial justice and equity in sex education. Dr. Nikisha is going to share one concrete tool that you can use to put this into practice. She's going to share a soon to be released lesson from Advocate for Youth 3 R's curriculum about racism and sexual health, and also provide a preview of the racial justice and sex ed online modules and virtual professional development skills. I'm really excited and always happy to introduce my beloved friend, Dr. Nikisha Floyd.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's always great to see you. And I am so happy to be here. Again, my name is Nikisha Floyd, and I am with Advocates for Youth. And so many of you may know that Advocates for Youth, the mission of our organization is to partner with youth leaders, adult allies, and youth serving organizations to advocate for policies and champion programs that recognize young people's right to honest sexual health information, the accessibility and confidentiality, and having affordable sexual health services, and also to create resources and opportunities necessary to create sexual health equity for all youth. And so one way that we are actively working to uplift sexual health equity for all young people is by creating resources and opportunities through the development of classroom lessons and teacher training modules that center the role and impact of race on sex and sexuality. Next slide, please. So the first is the lessons for students that are available. Next slide, please. So last year, Advocates in their 3 R's curriculum, which is free, provided supplemental lessons that focused on racial justice and reproductive justice. And one thing that you may hear often, particularly in the reproductive justice world, is that racial justice is reproductive justice. And so those supplemental lessons that are available, they highlight racial justice and reproductive justice for middle and high school students. And so 5 lessons were released, and the 5 lessons are actually listed there on the slides for you. So the what racism got to do with it is a middle school lesson. And then the impact of racism inequity on sexual health is a high school lesson. And then we have 3 lessons that really focus on reproductive justice. So that's reproductive justice, past, present, and future, sexual agency, and power and privilege. Again, all of those are high school lessons. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about preparing teachers to teach those lessons, that's important as well. I know that in the previous presentation by Dr. Raina Dixon, she talked a lot about educators being prepared to work with young people by doing the work and being reflective, and also making sure that they are constantly turning inward and focusing on themselves and thinking about the ways that they may have implicit biases that impact the way that they are working with young people and teaching lessons. So one thing that advocates we are doing is we're creating online modules that, again, are working to center race and racism in a very reflective, thought out way. And so that is what I will talk about next. Next slide, please. So the training, teacher training modules that are being developed at this time, it's a series of 10 30 to 45-minute online modules that are intended for teachers in K-12 who are responsible for teaching health education or sex education. It is a partnership with Sister Reach, which is a reproductive justice agency that is out of Memphis, Tennessee, and also with Cindy Lee Alves, who is the thought partner and content creator working with me on this particular assignment. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the online modules is really to, one, support the 3R lessons that focus on the impact of racism and the reproductive justice that I just mentioned earlier. But it's also there to help hone skills for educators. And so how that will be done is the modules will be released in 2 phases. So there's a phase 1 and phase 2, 5 modules for each phase. And each phase will also be followed with virtual professional development scenarios. So teachers will have the opportunity to participate in virtual professional development in order to highlight the skills that are being discussed and uplifted in the modules. Next slide, please. So I talked about the phases, right? So 2 phases. So the first phase, which is, like I said, in development at this time, is phase 1. Phase 1 will have the introduction and orientation module, which is a ground, just provides the groundwork for what is going to happen as teachers move through the 10 modules. And so it will provide information on the, will provide an overview of the module series. It will provide the best ways that teachers can really use the series. It will also provide recommendations in the role as the learner. So providing opportunities for reflection, thinking about peer-to-peer conversations and work that can be done in order to constantly be reflective when thinking about the role of race and racism in sex education. It will have pre-work and have opportunities for continued work, including post-work. Because once again, this is something that is not supposed to be a check all and you check the box and you're done, right? Race has been something that has been a part of our social landscape for since the inception of this country. So it's something that is not a quick fix. This is something that will constantly need reflection and working in order to deal with it and address it in a way that is productive. And so the modules will be race and racism and its impact on sex ed. That's module 1. Module 2 will really talk about white privilege and sex ed and really dive into understanding white supremacy, white privilege, and those concepts. Module 3 is racism and youth sexual health outcomes. So really diving in and looking at the social determinants of health and how racism is a social determinant and how that impacts health outcomes for folks. Module 4 will be racial justice and sex ed, and module 5 will be reproductive justice and sex ed. Next slide, please. So then the second phase will focus on topics like intersectionality, implicit bias, microaggressions, internalized racism, and then capping off this first set of 10 modules with strategies for dismantling white supremacy in sex education. Next slide, please. So we want to let people know that this the modules are being put together in a very well thought out way. We didn't just take information and then just put it on a slide, right? It was thought out using theoretical frameworks. We focused on adult learning theory, critical race theory. We are incorporating public health education theoretical frameworks and models. Once again, for the public health perspective, we're looking at like social ecological model and how, you know, there are levels to the way that racism impacts people and community and peers and organizations, the political landscape, et cetera. And then we're also looking through the lens of the social determinants of health, which actually ends up impacting sexual health outcomes. So from there, we're looking at the lack of education, health and healthcare access, social and political and community context, and then economic stability. And then we are also looking at and really connecting dots for educators about past and present policies and legislation that impact sex education and reproductive health outcomes. And then we are definitely looking at how to incorporate the theory of multiple intelligences. So we understand that people learn differently, and that is no different for adults, for teachers. And so in order to make sure that we are creating opportunities that are enriched, we are looking at different ways in how to provide the information in a way that is meaningful. Next slide. And so the learning modalities that are being included in the online learning modules will include, can you go back to that slide, please? Okay, thank you. The learning modalities, the media. So we're looking and really taking media clips and playing media clips and allowing you to hear different situations or different people talking about certain things related to race and racism, and then allowing for processing questions, right? Things that allow you to not only process what you just seen, but also process what it is and be reflective on how it may show up in the schools that you work in or in the communities that you live or even your own lives. And so that is how media is being used. We're definitely going to provide readings for people to have as an opportunity to really engage and learn about the content in depth. We are looking at, like I said, application. So we want to make sure that we're connecting the dots and really pointing out how, you know, these concepts that we are discussing show up in your classrooms, in your schools, in the policies that are in your schools, and even legislation. So how do we talk about this with young people in real time? We will have resource pages for each of the modules. We will have glossary terms that are also there in order to make sure that we constantly have everyone on the same educational learning playing field. So there are no words or terms that are out there that people are not aware of what they mean, or what they mean particularly in the context of the modules that we are providing. And then we are working to make sure that we have the opportunity for continuing education credits. So for folks who are certified health education specialists, we are working to make sure that we can provide CHES credit, or certified health education specialist credits, for people who complete the modules and are interested in having the opportunity to gain continuing education credits for that. Next slide, please. So one thing that we're very focused on is making sure that this work does not happen in a vacuum, right? We know that when we have work, particularly something that's heavy as race and racism, that we do this work in community. And so one way to make sure that advocates, that we are putting out great information, great resources for people, is to have lots of eyes looking and vetting, and also providing feedback on the information and resources that we are disseminating. So ways that we are doing that is to have racial justice advisory councils. And we have two that once again provide feedback to the work. So there's the professional advisory council, which is a council of professionals that are experts in the field of race and racism, particularly when we're talking about sex education. And then we are currently recruiting for our youth advisory council. And so next slide, please. Here is the professional advisory council. As you can see, we have some real powerhouses on our council. So we have Dr. Jamie Campbell, Marietta, Gary Smith, Cindy Lee Alves, Justine Engafonte, Alicia Andrews, Gabrielle Evans, Sadia Ashard, and Trina Scott. Together, they bring a very unique lens with their level of expertise in the different containers that they have, in ways to be very reflective in the best ways to provide education on really addressing race and racism in sex education. Next slide. And so our youth advisory council, again, we are currently recruiting for young people who are ages 16 to 24. The application deadline is July 15th. So if you know young people who this would be a great fit or something that they may be interested in, please do not hesitate to contact me, and I will provide you with the link to the application. We are very excited to bring young people on board, because what we know is that when we are doing work for young people, we have to have young people at the table, right? That's the way that the work is done when it's done in the best way. And this project is no different, right? So we are definitely centering the voices of young people in how do we uplift and talk about the impact of racism in sex ed. What are some of the things that they need to have teachers know and understand and hear when it comes down to the education that they are deserving of? And so, again, if you know of any young people that may be interested please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll happily send that information to you so you can get it out to the young folks in your networks. Next slide, please. And here's my contact information. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me and send me an email or give me a call, whatever way is best for you. Please, again, don't hesitate. I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nikisha, for that wonderful presentation. I just want to highlight right now that you're looking at a slide that has resources for the reports that you've heard about, for the articles from the youth that were part of the panel earlier, as well as the link for the 3Rs curriculum from Advocates for Youth. So we will be sending out resources after today's webinar, along with the slides and other information that will be emailed out to all who registered as participants. So this information will be made available to folks, and we appreciate all of the questions and your engagement with us. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who participated in today's webinar, all of our presenters, our youth presenters. I want to appreciate especially all of those of you who signed up to be here with us, to give your time, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you for sharing this time with us. I want to appreciate Jen, who's been working behind the scenes, navigating and negotiating and herding cats through all of this, and really am excited to see how this work continues to move forward. It is important that we all find ways to engage in the process of making sure that racial justice is a significant and important part of sex education. It's important, it's necessary, so that all young people have the access to information and resources to make informed decisions about their lives as they see fit. I appreciate you all being here and wish you well in the rest of your day. Thank you.